So, what are 15-minute cities? The idea of 15-minute cities is kind of a buzzword, a phrase that's been trotted about lately, that essentially means cities in which every neighborhood has all the basic amenities within a 15-minute walking distance. So, like shopping, restaurants like grocery stores, pharmacies, workplaces, although presumably not everyone will be able to get a job within 15 minutes of them. But it would involve like essentially a community with a mix of commercial and residential and government buildings, all within a 15-minute walk. Now, the whole idea of 15-minute cities has been mocked quite a bit by conspiracy theorists who claim that the intent of these cities is to create communities that you're not allowed to leave, kind of like the restrictions of 2020 and 2021 that were placed on many people across the world because of the big event that occurred then. But in this case, it would be because of climate change that you'd have these neighborhoods where everything is within a 15-minute walk, but you're not allowed to leave because being allowed to leave contributes to carbon emissions. Now, the thing is, theoretically, if you're allowed to take public transit, walk, or bike, that wouldn't contribute much to carbon emissions. So I don't see the need from an environmentalist perspective of keeping people confined in that regard. It would only be limiting driving. And even in that case, like a lot of the elites seem to be pretty heavy in favor of electric cars, even those who call themselves environmentalists, despite the issues with electric cars. So again, I don't see that happening either. But yeah, by and large, the problems with that is just, frankly, like my question is, what is really the problem of the idea of a 15-minute city, assuming that you were actually allowed to leave? And also, okay, another problem, obviously, with these 15-minute cities is that they probably would, if they're building new neighborhoods like this, they would probably have ugly modernist architecture. But at the same time, you can say the same thing for the suburban low-density housing developments being slapped up in the hinterlands of North American cities everywhere, too. A lot of these places are hideous also. So, I mean, that's not something unique to 15-minute cities. That's more a general problem with architecture today. But yes, by and large, okay, like if you're talking about like what is fundamentally the problem, assuming you're allowed to leave, and also assuming like, okay, if these 15-minute cities involve all this like smart city crap, like I'm definitely against that. Like I'm against expanding surveillance technology and making everything smart objects everywhere you go. Like I'm definitely against the Internet of Things, and insofar as it becomes like this like surveillance state. Like absolutely fuck that shit. But again, that's not something that's intrinsic to the idea of 15-minute cities, nor is it something that's extrinsic to suburbia. You could have suburban communities where every home is wired, where everything is a smart object, everything is monitored. You could definitely have that in a suburban community too. There's no reason you couldn't. But yeah, I mean, when you look at the idea of 15-minute cities, like basically almost everywhere in Europe built prior to the 20th century or prior to World War II would be, in essence, a 15-minute city. Like if you look at Paris or Rome or Stockholm, all these neighborhoods are essentially 15-minute cities, like all our traditional European neighborhoods, even in smaller towns in Europe, villages, anywhere basically. And even in North America, I would say most places prior to like the late 1800s would be 15-minute cities, because in North America you did start getting the streetcar suburbs in the late 1800s, the late 19th century, and then suburbia started expanding more in the early 20th century. I think particularly in the 20s, but then it really started taking off in the 1950s with the advent of the interstate system and post-World War II suburban sprawl. So yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be, but I would say most places in the United States even, or Canada, prior to like the late 1800s would be essentially 15-minute cities. And even a great deal of the places I'd say built between the late 1800s and World War II. Not all to the extent as in Europe, but still I would say, if not most, then many. So yeah, I mean, the idea of 15-minute cities is very much in line with traditional Western civilization. It's just, yeah, if it does involve all this creepy shit like smart communities, like smart devices everywhere, or just ugly modernist architecture, or like people not being allowed to leave, like curfews and all these other restrictions. Obviously, I'm against those things, but my point is, how are those things intrinsic to denser communities and extrinsic to low density communities? You could have all these kinds of issues in low density communities also, all this surveillance totalitarianism. And we've had communities in Western civilization for hundreds, thousands of years that have been essentially 15-minute cities. That's just how society used to be before the advent of the automobile. And I guess to a lesser extent, the streetcar in the United States beforehand. But even with the streetcar suburbs, those were still not as sprawling as the automotive suburbs of the 50s and later on, because simply there was just less ability for people to get to, to, like, they didn't have cars until a bit later. So those kinds of suburbs, while they were somewhat sprawled compared to what came before, they still wouldn't be as sprawling as what we have now. So yeah, but my point is, yeah, like what is inherently anti-traditional about the idea of walkable communities when in fact those were the norm for all of the history of Western civilization up until basically the 20th century? Like, that's my question. Like, why are you saying that that kind of thing goes against our heritage when that actually is our heritage? Like, don't get me wrong. As I said, like, if it's about creepy surveillance shit, I'm against that as much as anyone. If it's about arbitrary curfews and just random totalitarian restrictions on movement, yeah, I'm against that as much as anyone. But those things, as I said, they're not intrinsic to walkable communities, and they're not extrinsic to non-walkable communities. You can have suburbs with surveillance tech everywhere, with smart shit everywhere that's just forced on everyone, with arbitrary restrictions on when you can and can't leave, with ugly modernist architecture. You can have all these things in suburbs, and in many cases you do. Well, at least with the ugly architecture, not so much yet with the surveillance tech, but that could be coming. I mean, there's a lot of surveillance tech already in people's homes that they have there voluntarily. But the question is how much of it will be expanded involuntarily. Very much could be. But my point is, this is not something that's innate to walkable communities, or that's impossible with non-walkable communities. So it's really conflating two different things and lumping them together, which is complete bullshit. Like, one thing that's largely a good thing, which is traditional style walkable communities, and another thing that's largely a bad thing, which is the expansion of just surveillance technology literally everywhere, or just arbitrary totalitarian rules. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the whole 15-minute cities issue.